Well, Joe O'Brien is in Hyde Park in Sydney, and Joe, the weather is certainly treating the crowd a treat because it is a fantastic day in Sydney for so many people to turn out on this very special day.
It's a beautiful day in Sydney, Andrew, and one of the people here is Joshua Thunder. His great-grandfather, Stanley Watson, was one of the first to arrive at Anzac Cove and one of the last to leave. And Joshua's just written a book about it. Joshua, welcome. What does it feel like to be here on a day like today when you've taken such an interest in your great-grandfather's history?
Joe, it's very moving, and one of the things that Australia does so well is to take pride in that past, to take sadness in it as well. But there's no triumphalism in this crowd. It's a sunny day, but people are really entering into that spirit, and that makes me proud as well.
So tell us a bit more about your grandfather's story.
So my great-grandfather was a sapper and a signalman. Started in Adelaide, went to Broadmeadows, and then went to Egypt to train. And he was amongst the very first to arrive in Gallipoli. But after the landings, which were a debacle, they needed to build a pier right in the middle of Anzac Cove. He designed it, he recruited the men to do it under great danger, and also found the materials.
And that was a pier that survived for the duration?
Well, it was washed away many times. They had to rebuild it in order to escape from Gallipoli in the end.
And that's one of the extraordinary things, is that the Turks were only a couple of hundred metres away, and yet the Anzacs were able to kind of establish this virtually little city or community that they were kind of feeding their front lines from.
That's right. Anzac Cove was in full view of the Turks.
Yeah.
North Beach had a little bit of shelter from their gun sights, but they managed to work through the night and also in great danger during the day at risk of Turkish shelling.
Was the shelling actually getting anywhere near the pier at stages?
Joe, the pier was in full view of the Turks, and they could lob bombs on it at any stage they wanted, and they did.
Yeah, so it's curious, how were they able to maintain it under those circumstances?
It's like going over the top, Joe. It's hard for us to go back and imagine how it is to do that with bravery and with real resolve.
So when did you develop the passion, so much of a passion for this, that you actually wanted to write a book about it?
Well, the very strong images I have of my great-grandfather started when I was a small boy and listened to his war stories. And he was brave enough to tell me those, because most people didn't get the chance to listen to those stories because it was such a pain for those men to remember. Yeah. So it started then, but then he also wrote an account, and at the age of 89 went back to Gallipoli to revisit the beach, and revisit the beach where they were meant to land. So he had a passion for it, and many of those images and that passion I've inherited.
And what were some of those recollections of the landing itself? The soldiers drowning under the weight of what they were wearing and coming under heavy fire?
Well, he had very strong memories of those, and I think something that burned in him very strongly was the unnecessary death. As a signalman, he couldn't get signals up into the hills where the men had scrambled. So the lack of coordination and the inexperience of the Australian troops was a frustration. It led to a campaign that wasn't as good as it could have been, even after the British military and Navy had made their mistakes. Australia was also inexperienced, and that was part of his story.
And the decision was made to evacuate. It was a difficult decision because the commanders believed that possibly 30% of the remaining troops there were possibly going to be killed in an evacuation exercise. Why did it end up being so successful? It was a disastrous campaign overall, but why did that evacuation end up being so successful? And I believe your great-grandfather was one of the very last to leave.
I think there's a tipping point in the campaign at Gallipoli. From a failed landing, and learning from that, the Australian command decided to try and do better on the evacuation, despite the expectation of vast losses. They introduced intermittent warfare to give themselves time to leave. They had no space on the beach to leave, but by having campaigns for 2 or 3 days and then having the discipline to not pull the trigger for 2 or 3 days, they lulled the Turks into a sense of on-off warfare, and then they made all the preparations down to the last man and their practicing of it to get off in just 2 nights. And my great-grandfather was the second last man to leave Gallipoli, and his moment of pride, but tinged with sadness, was his role in the evacuation and the flight of the Anzacs from Gallipoli.
And what was his sense about war at the very end, and the message, the crucial messages from Gallipoli about war?
He was very clear that this was a futile war. He went on to another 3 years in France. After the moment they evacuated, when dusk settled on 2 enemies and dawn rose on a Turkish homeland and the Anzac's freedom, 3 years later he was still at war in Europe. That was a long, hard grind. They faced heavy artillery, gas and mud and trenches. In the end they got through, but it was a regret for him the whole war.
Yeah. Okay, Joshua Funder, thanks for talking to us. It's just so great to be able to talk to you on a day like today when your great-grandfather was had played such a critical role at Gallipoli.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Okay, that's it from me for the moment at the Sydney Parade. As you can see, it's continuing now. We're in Hyde Park. There'll be a service at there's the beautiful Anzac Memorial here in Hyde Park in a couple of hours' time. But for now, back to you in the studio, Andrew.